Homo Corruptus by N.D. Wallace-Swan. Where there's a will, there's a way. All can be overcome through the power of will, but one must first possess it. It's been a long period of growth towards higher civilization in the West. We have been seated high for so long that the notion of precipice is foreign. Sliding downwards we accelerate, subtly, then suddenly. It is arguable as to when and where this downtrend began, and varies as much as the people you ask. Some say it was the fall of the USSR which caused complacency in the West. But the USSR was in collapse since its founding, in a struggle of its own, in parallel with the West. But the USSR was less resilient and less capable of handling the entropic strain. A brief exploration and turn. Some say it was the Vietnam War, but that was a symptom. Some claim it was the Second or First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, the Russian Revolution, the Russo-Japanese War, the Spanish-American War. No. These are symptoms of a grand malaise. What about the Napoleonic Wars or the French Revolution? The former a symptom, the latter a hatching egg. Instead, I claim that the end of the upward struggle of the West is best defined by something seemingly unrelated: the first public performance of Johann Strauss II's Blue Danube, which first played at Vienna's Diana Baths on February 15, 1867. It was also played at the World Fair in Paris that same year. In Great Britain the Fenian Rising breaks out, beginning the end of British rule in Ireland. We also have the Luxembourg crisis, which nearly set off a Franco-Prussian war later happening in 1870. Canada becomes mostly independent from the Empire in the same year. Alaska is purchased by the USA for 2 cents per acre from the Russian Empire, both of which come to undermine European colonialism. Alfred Nobel patents dynamite. The Emperor of Mexico is executed, and that same day Buenos Aires plays its first football match. Disraeli's Second Reform Act enfranchised nearly double the previous number of voting men as before. Karl Marx publishes his first volume of Das Kapital. This was also the last year penal ships were sent overseas from Britain. The Paraguayan War rages still in South America. Asleep at the wheel. Queen Victoria lost her husband Albert 6 years prior and remained in mourning the rest of her life, outside of her royal duties, essentially spending the remainder of her reign on vacation as a head of state in de facto absentia. The contemporary propaganda at the time conveyed a message of a massively huge and flourishing British Empire, when in reality in under a century, near wholly gone and nominally persisting as the Commonwealth. Her Royal Highness, Queen Victoria, asleep at the imperial helm, died in 1901, crashing the British Empire onto the rocky beaches of the Isle of Wight, having long abandoned the necessary imperial spirit. What would she have said had she witnessed the coming world war between her grandsons, who sent millions of good and honest men to their deaths, instead spending some 4 decades moping around doing her widow's walkabout? For her reign, the empire remained well stocked with strong institutional momentum, and so the necessary functions of the empire carried on. By most recollections of history so far published, it was the glory of the Victorian era. The great wonder of the Industrial Revolution. New worlds. New peoples. Technologies. Prometheus born again arises this new coal-powered prosperity and human development. The relevant statistics do not lie, though I will not bore the reader with them nor challenge them. But yes, we have here in 1867 the peak of the British Empire. It wasn't clean-cut growth devoid of bloodshed, but in comparison to past empires it was one of the best to most people. But not people like those who mine for coal, they who choke, cough, and perish, generation after generation in unimaginable poverty and privation. This sacrifice is surely considered while the British political elite invite half of the old empire to its shores. Even at the sacrifice of the progeny of the founders who toiled in the mines and fields, breaking both sweat and back for the good of the nation. Not a dozen years had passed from the death of Queen Victoria when these working men would be sent off to die in 1914 and onwards against the dreaded Kaiserreich in France, with millions slaughtering other millions in a pointless and stupid conflict that was entirely avoidable had better men been at the helm. These men today are all but forgotten, but for a poppy. An ode to sacrifice, a reflection. Today, thousands upon thousands of foreign hordes land upon British beaches, looking for a handout, claiming to be refugees. Should the good Brits rise up to repel the invader, the state will smack you down, attack you, and punish you over your transgressions, treating you as an insurgent against the crown. Who voted for this? No Brit did, yet in lockstep all parties impose it on the British people. This policy has nothing to do with democratic will, so what causes this? Perhaps the government can do nothing about it. The UK, despite its pomp and ceremony, is in a period of chaotic interregnum. With a limited state apparatus, it chooses to expend resources on foreign interests at the expense of domestic interest. This is completely unique in history. One might think this is a function of basic governance, but given the total inaction, given it is a popular issue, stopping the crossings, perhaps the whole of the UK government is a facade, an imperceptible spirit, a ghost government propped up by a great game of mass media charades. Surfing the Kali Yuga. Consider the NHS. Has it ever been worse? What about the preservation of historical monuments and places of history concerning English and British heritage? Priceless castles and artifacts, strewn about the countryside with little to no maintenance, falling apart, to ruin, kept barely there by the fledgling English Heritage Society begging for donations? Why? The UK, which is not alone in the world, is possibly a corporate zombie state with only the basis central nervous system, each limb operating independently from the main body, in a constant war of attrition and slowly tearing itself limb from limb, only to stitch parts back on haphazardly, creating enormous festering scars and wounds, with indigenous Brits running for the hills and the yonder shires to escape the chaotic malaise of the major metropole. Where are we now? We are very much today in a similar circumstance to 1901. The Queen has died. She was held in great reverence. Her son, at this time an old man, has ascended to the throne. He has no cousins seated throughout the thrones of continental Europe, yet still we are on the verge of world war. Escalation is in the cards, the great Central Alliance readies itself. The EU stands alongside its imperial suzerain NATO, in defiance of the Russian intervention in the Donbas region of what was Ukraine. Nuclear threat keeps a world war at bay, but for how long? How many Russian men can be destroyed by Western-supplied arms before Russia and Putin are provoked to total war escalation? What will NATO do should Russia be taken from the board? Will the thoughtful, wise, but formerly oppressed Russian people now elegantly kneel towards the purely moral and ethical propositions of global homogeneity? Perhaps Russia, too, is an interregnum? Should Russia lose Putin, what good can that do for the West? Any? It would create a power vacuum worse than in the former USSR in the 1990s. Tens of millions will needlessly suffer or die. For what? Ideological drive lacking spiritual guidance? A lack of foresight? Oil? Furthermore, are not the great powers, India, China, the USA, NATO, Turkey, Russia, and the EU building up military resources unseen since the Second World War? Are these same powers now not hampering and shifting trade around the world, threatening the developing world especially with starvation and privation? If the mass media were not spreading news around the world, would anyone even know? At this point the only thing holding us back from this brink is whether the media chooses to convince us to accept this war as necessary and inevitable. It will all be lies. We seem to be between 1901 and 1914, though the scales are twisted, stretched and compacted in various manners which make discernment difficult. The Queen is dead. Long live the King. The great powers gather for a great dance of swords. We in the West, though we are hardly unique in being this way, have incompetent, out-of-control leadership, willing to flout the rights guarantees laid out in our founding documents, having zero qualms with resorting to extortion or violence as necessary means to ends. Canada is led by a middle school drama teacher. The great USA is led by a man suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's disease. The UK is led by a banking cartel lackey, while the EU is run by an endless parade of faceless bureaucrats. Like never before, or perhaps somewhat in line with the early 20th century, the Western state acts more like a mafia than a proper nation. Discussion is done in secret. Opinions are actively withheld over fear of reprisal. Men and women alike follow orders regardless of content to ensure their finances are unaffected. No real checks and balances are performed. The judiciary defers to the mafioso state, despite its unfair material advantage. As a result, people begin to take extrajudicial action as their rights are not reasonably protected. Law becomes a tool of state policy rather than a set of abided principles used to guide action. Alternative forms of resolution become more and more popular as the legal system becomes less and less relevant. Eventually lawlessness becomes the de facto within the facade of the de jure. Veni, vidi, vici. In such a scenario, a rising Caesar becomes less of a necessity and more of an inevitability, to return to a proper order of things, to some semblance of governance. In his will to action, he exercises exceptional powers to sweep aside the corruption and bureaucratic rot which has infected the power structure. Letting it be means to leave it to spiral, where it cannot self-correct. The inevitability of Caesar is obvious, and the only alternative is civilizational collapse. Whether or not a rising Caesar is legal in his actions are morally and ethically correct and necessary. The present interregnum offers nothing but decline. It offers no hope outside its shadowy facades. It threatens and damages peaceful, productive, and good people, while promoting the immoral and unethical, who are a social and civilizational danger. This is by no means anarchy, and is instead a kleptocracy veiled in unjustified authority. If the alleged good people were to withdraw de facto support of the pretender regime, it would eventually fail to stand. But a catalyst is required, as it is in any reaction equation. Without this, doom awaits. It is therefore, for the sake of civilization, imperative that a Caesar is brought forth. We must clear a path, so should a man of the necessary caliber arrive, he finds the pathway to his destiny. Whether or not we succeed will depend on how persuasive our authoring. In turn, this will rely on our capacity to accept or deny pain and reality. If you don't believe me, there is no need, nor am I concerned. Pain will make you a believer.